lockdown must have driven you to try to think about a way to be together alone. Tell us a little bit about, how you came to it. I'm sure people are interested in the specificity of the music and how you were able to match the music with the particular acoustic practices that we were instructed in.
Yeah. I should say, or maybe qualify my antagonism towards participation. I think I'm really, really interested in co-presence and in heightened states of kind of somatic togetherness, but I try to lure people there a little bit, not without consent, maybe still under the sort of social contract of the art experience, but a little bit less directly asking for a really kind of on-the-nose participation like that. So that was the new part, and I'm very curious how it felt for everybody. I'll be excited for the break and grabbing a beer with you all when we have that minute. But yeah, like I said, I really enjoyed and indulged the stillness of lockdown. I had a pile of work that stopped. I was kind of in a state of, as we all were, many of us at least who had the privilege to not be in the quote-unquote essential fields of labor, was kind of frantically taking in the news and trying to understand what the hell was happening. I had been visiting Xavi on spring break and then didn't leave for a year and a half, so that was a real silver lining of our long-distance relationship for lockdown. But when I did kind of snap back out of that stupor, I couldn't turn back to the pile of deadlines I had on my desk. It just didn't make any sense to sort of continue that kind of labor at that moment, and less out of an urge to create and produce, and I think more out of an urge to ask what my specific sensibility, my specific lived experience and intelligences might have to offer back to the particular and specific crisis of that moment. I just started experimenting and asking, again, how could I get this liveness and this dynamism and this sort of full-bodied listening that I try to offer as an artist and really crave as a listener and as a sentient being. So that was the urge, and then I just started randomly wandering around our apartment, rubbing pieces of styrofoam and cardboard all over me and all over Xavi and anybody I could sort of lure into the experiment with me. And I was looking for just ubiquity, like what would everybody have around that I could be specific enough that I could compose for, but not so specific that it would require you to have a package sent to your doorstep or order something specific. So I settled on the pint glass or the mason jars, which is what we had at home. And I loved what they did with pure silence. They work like conch shells a little bit. I loved the sort of universe and the everything that kind of, as that white noise filters and what it exposes and the kind of listening that happens when they're fully encapsulating your ears, which is pretty amniotic, actually. It's like that's how we hear in the womb. For those who are kind of audio heads in the room, or if you're not, maybe I could just, I invoke this difference between a contact mic and an air mic in the description. And sound most off, in case that's unfamiliar terminology to you, sound usually hits our ears through air. So it's molecules bumping molecules, bumping molecules, bumping molecules, and if we're close enough, they bump our eardrums and send signals to our brain that's processed as sound. Contact mics actually don't pick up reverberations and pressure waves in the air. They only affix to surfaces, so they pass through, you can affix them to, stages or tables or cheeks. So when we cover our ears like this, our skull really becomes a contact microphone. We're only hearing vibration pass through our bones and through our flesh and through our hands, and which is why everything sounds really, really different if you try to particularly hear yourself speak in that state. So I was drawn to just the baseline phenomena, and then I just really began a series of empirical experiments, which is really how I work. I think P-Staff actually talked about working somatically, really putting their body in a space, and that's also really how I work. It's a very intense, tactile state of play and exploration that then kind of there's that phase, and then there's a sort of intense study of those phenomena that I explore and a sculpting of them into time, in this case, into time and this understanding of score. Oftentimes into space, actually, and how things are mapped spatially in the fuller productions that I create. So it happened like that. It was sort of a 3-week burst, and I should also give credit and thanks to Leah Wolfman, the visual designer of the video score. So that's just literally me on an iPhone sitting at our desk, and we shared it with Leah, and Leah treated it with these really interesting custom filters that they create. So it sort of went to that stage and then went off into the world.
So you're saying that the music was created from these sort of the friction against these different materials. That's how you created what we're hearing as music.
Yeah, so again, the baseline constraint was shitty computer speakers. Like, it couldn't require more tech than that. So I turned them all the way up, and then I just tried different frequencies, and because of I could predict the rough size of the cylinder, if we're talking about pint glass as base constraint, certain of those frequencies get caught and amplify inside of that. So there are these spectra, these like kind of chaotic phenomena that don't emerge if you're just listening like this. But then when you come back and you kind of open them up, they just sort of blossom up the spectrum and access all these different frequencies and amplify some and filter others out. And that's how the kind of dynamism adds that. That's how the added layer of dynamism on top of that fixed score interacts.
I was thinking about Karen Barad's work on the vacuum when I was doing this, because of course the glass is supposed to be full. I mean, I'm not talking metaphysically, half full, half empty. I'm saying that the way that we use the glass, it's supposed to be a vessel for liquid. And there's something about that emptiness that you're managing to send sound through that reminds us that empty space is also full of activity that we may or may not be aware of. And the experience for me of participating in the experiment was to think about how acoustically imprecise we are, like that we don't realize how modulated sound is as it reaches us, and all the different materials that conduct sound on its way to us or block sound. So it was a sort of pedagogical piece as well. I wonder if you want to talk about the transformation from mason jar to pint jar. Does it matter? I mean, we're in England. People couldn't get mason jars; they got pint jars. Does that make a difference? I know that in some of the stuff about the piece, you've talked about the importance of the mason jar to this piece. So I wondered what happened when we changed the vessel.
Yeah, changing the size would really impact the experience. If you went to a really small vessel, a lot of those frequencies wouldn't get caught in the same way. If you went to too big of a vessel, different ones would get lost. Some of the higher ones would get lost. So I was really just looking for a kind of ubiquity. We had jars lying around because Xavi is Basque and they put everything in jars. And I figured, again, just like a 16 to 32 ounce sort of situation would be relatively easy for people to find.
But it kind of connects to some of Xavi's work in the sense that a mason jar is used most often for pickling and for preserving fruit, so that it doesn't have to be eaten in its moment, but could be eaten later. And then Xavi was talking a lot about what runs through us and what we run through, and you're talking in somewhat adjacent ways about sound that runs through us and that then passes through us and becomes a different order of material. So I was thinking the mason jar probably does have a kind of resonance beyond just what kind of conductor of sound it is.
Yeah, it could.
I mean, and then the other piece that struck me was about the relation between the ordinary and the extraordinary in this piece. And I was, Lauren Ballant sort of talks about the extraordinary, ordinary, and because we're so used to sort of tuning out or into sound environments rather than living with all of the modulations of the ambient, the piece forces us to pay attention in a certain kind of way, which maybe was an attention that was available in particular during lockdown. So what about the ordinariness? Because you said it was just what we had around. It was in the space that we shared. I was just sitting at the desk. I'm using the iPhone. There's a sense of what's at hand and what's available, and then creating this extraordinary piece out of the ordinary. It seems to me there's a relation there.
Yeah, and I think it has a relation to plant medicines and MDMA and some of the other tools of enlivening the senses and shutting off the kind of frontal lobe and allowing us to access a state of sensory wonder that is a lot more childlike and full of curiosity and potential if we just turned our words off long enough to actually stop and feel and be with one another. And I think oftentimes in club spaces, which are, like this used to be, and that I know, are very important to many of the folks in here, myself included, most often there it is through drugs or through extreme volume that the words get turned off, that this sense of kind of sensual awakeness is really legislated. You can't really talk there, or you're huddled in the bathroom stall, which are a lot dirtier than they looked in, in the beautiful Acid Plumbing video we just saw. So there's a way of like through the forced intensity of loudness that sensuality is invited and invoked. And I think a lot of my work, I build oftentimes to that sensory overwhelm, but I think there's so many different types of loudness and intensity we can explore. And I'm also really interested in, I talk a lot about this kind of like woods at night state of listening. If you're ever like alone in the woods and it's dark, and like, almost silent, but you can just hear a twig snap and your body knows if that's 3 centimeters to your right or 6 feet in front of you, even if you can't see it. There's like a bit of fear inside of that hyper awakeness that I think also invites a sensual wonder. And so I think I'm moving between those extremes, and that's why I think it was really amazing to share Hive Rise, the piece that Xavi showed an image of at Berghain, because I had so many people come up to me afterwards and say, I have never heard this room that quiet. Like everybody, it starts just this kind of ASMR patter of just like barely there, and it builds to this absolute storm of sensory intensity. But the kind of way it hypnotized everybody and drew them into this different kind of subtlety and attention and nuance, I think is maybe where I stretch the plant medicinal or stretch the kind of MDMA high of a lot of queer culture out into the daytime or spaces like this.
Well, can we talk about Hive Mind a little bit? Were you going to show us any?
Yeah, so I actually I wanted to draw some threads out to some of my bigger work, which really is, as I mentioned, very spatial, full-bodied, to be honest, almost impossible to capture because of that. There are often, in The Force of Things, a piece I want to share, and a little bit of Hive Rise, there's 46 sound sources and speakers and performers moving all around you. So with that grain of salt, I did want to try to make some connections. I think in many ways, interior listening protocol is a microcosm of some of these more macro concerns in my work. I'll just state some sort of umbrella threads that I want to weave. I work at this point in my creative evolution entirely with custom instruments that I've made myself. Some of those are 85 feet long, some of those fit in the palm of your hand, some of them are 3D printed, some of them are off-the-shelf objects that are repurposed. But they all do, thank you so much. They all do two things primarily, or maybe more than two, at least two things. They allow me to access this kind of acoustic wildness and these chaotic sonic phenomena that have really been bred out of domesticated Western instruments. So for decades and centuries, clarinets and pianos, and they have been standardized both through the engineering of those instruments, through the processes of symbolic notation, and through the way that players are trained to activate them, through a very specific kind of dominance and control and mastery and predictability and coherence. So I spent many of my early years trying to get those instruments to be wild, detuning double bass strings way, way low, playing piano strings on the inside with pieces of glass that are like slowly smearing over them. But I just eventually realized I couldn't fight through the barrier of those bodies trained in that kind of formalism, working in a concert setup. I couldn't get the sound out. I couldn't get the kind of somatic communal experience I was really after. So yes, I work now entirely with these custom instruments, and I really want to walk you through a couple of them right now to show you how they aggregate into these larger, more full-bodied experiences. This is also going to give me a chance to lean into the way I have worked and turned towards climate crisis in my practice. It is a decidedly unrepresentational way to make that turn. There are no words, there are no statistics, there are no pictures of emaciated polar bears. There's also actually know recordings of water or rainforests. So it even goes into that sonic level, or soaring melodies in the minor key to kind of represent our trauma. So how can I then claim that The Force of Things, which is an immersive installation opera, wrestles with the rising tide of eco-anxiety inside of us is one of the things I want to try to share right now. Let's see, I think I go that way. So to understand The Force of Things and to understand Hive-Rise, I'm playing 2 of these in my rig in Hive-Rise. I have to explain just a little bit about subaudible frequencies. So this is just a picture of a speaker cone. You have speaker cones inside of your phone. They look just like this. All they do is move up and move down, and move up and move down. And as they do that, they bump air that eventually, again, if you're close enough, bumps your eardrum and turns into sound in your brain. So in The Force of Things, there is a network of 32 of these speaker cones spread throughout this massive warehouse space. But for the vast majority of the piece, they're actually vibrating at a subaudible level. So they're moving too slowly and producing sound which is too low for humans to hear. But there's the crazy thing that happens in the senses, actually. The moment it becomes too low to hear, it becomes slow enough to see, actually. And then when we could start to hear it around, when it goes up and down at least around 20 times a second, it gets that kind of stillness that animation has, or continuity of blur. So what you're gonna hear, I'm just gonna play you one example before we dive into the fuller video excerpts of me. It's 2 speaker cones and only my hands. There's no processing, there's no other layer. You're just hearing the palpitation, the cone go up and down, and you're hearing it slap against my hands and my flesh and my fingertips and my knuckles and my nails, and that's the kind of timbral evolution that I'm surfing, theoretically. So again, just to reiterate, you're not hearing the sound wave coming out of the speaker. You're hearing it slap against my skin, and my muscles and knuckles. And for us at the time, I think it really, which again is the rig I'm playing in the Berghain and the Mocha Geffen show. This sense of reaching past the boundary of human perception, sort of past our capabilities, lower than we're supposed to hear, towards a volatility that is omnipresent around us but inaudible to us. I think at the time I was working on this piece with my brother, who's an architect. We co-created the piece together, and we were reading Tim Morton at the time and really feeling this sense of the massiveness of climate crisis and the eco-anxiety that's sort of swelling and running through us, and this sense that he has about the kind of, gosh, I can't even remember the stickiness of it, that we can't see the entirety of climate crisis, but we can see the sunburn on our skin, we can see the hurricane emerge, we see these emergences that come into our sort of perceptual capacities, but are omnipresent and really too large for us to have language, to have mythical structures to understand, to have really any narrative tactics to hold or to pursue. So that's a lot of what's running through this piece. This web of 32 subwoofers is sometimes played on with hands, and I'll show you a little bit of that, and other materials, but it's also connected via these just paracord kind of veins, like a nervous system, to the entire installation that's wrapping the audience. So the audience walks into a space that has no humans in it. It's sort of encased by these soft hanging hides that are really slippery in their referentiality. Depending on how they're lit, they can kind of look like the sort of hulking hides of ancient beasts, or like ashen sort of structures, or like melting glaciers, or they have a lot of sort of variability depending on how they're lit. And they undergo an evolution throughout the 55-minute piece. But here we hear those subwoofers, that subaudible frequency, not touching the bodies of humans, but instead shaking trembling the room around the audience until the arrival of the first humans in the piece. So we heard the subs there. I also want to nod to WALL-E, and another reason I love WALL-E actually here, which is that there's an entire drama and love story that emerges without language between those for like 90 minutes. We like don't hear, I mean, until the chubby humans come back. And I mean, it absolutely mystified me when I watched that film. And here I am in all of my work, actually, I don't think there's been a word in my work since I was 18 and a half, actually. Second year of grad school, of undergrad. And that's not to rant against all of the beautiful words that have been shared today and the power of language to help us metabolize and process and face everything that that's running through us and before us and behind us right now. But it is to really make a case for extra states of extra linguistic intensity and our sensorial capacities that are beyond and above and more than language. And so we have here in The Force of Things this first arrival of humans after 10 minutes of the audience kind of not really knowing what's going on, thinking that they're in stillness, and then it trembles, and then it trembles, and then it's like really shaking. It feels a bit like a machine that's about to collapse. And these two figures emerge, and they're holding megaphones, and they're gonna tell us what to do, and they're gonna make it all clear. And all we hear are these slivers of words and these edges of sounds and these just little pinpricks that really frustrate, I think, our desire for a semantic clarity and an understanding, and put the onus back on the audience as to whether they're going to follow deeper into the space or not. So I'll just keep scanning through a couple of these others. Another couple of shots of the subwoofers now being touched. I wanted to share some audio and shots of the monochords, which are also really fundamental to this piece. These are 85-foot double bass strings, essentially. They're made out of braided metal wire, like aircraft cable, we call it in the US. And they stretch up over these 5-foot styrofoam bridges and then tether like deep into the void of the performance space where the audience doesn't go. What's crazy about those styrofoam bridges, they act like a bridge like on a guitar or a violin would do. It adds tension, but they're actually a natural resonator as well. So no matter where you touch that string, it actually reverberates with this really outsized intensity from these kind of masses in the space of the audience. So there's this real stretching apart of cause and effect where like tiny little pitses and plucks 85 feet away reverberate with this outsized intensity in the listening space of the audience. So that's just one of them being plucked. Pause this there just in the interest of time. So there you see us really gesturing, again, towards a scale that's sort of too big for humans. It's too big for us to play with that kind of virtuosic mastery of a violin. It's pointing to these other time scales and kind of planetary scales in its expanse. Two last quick examples. There might be some Peter Frampton lovers in the room, if y'all lived through the 80s. He made really famous this guitar pedal called the talk box, where the sound of the guitar comes up through a tube, goes into his mouth, and then changing the shape of his mouth, he was able to make it seem like his guitar was talking just by changing the formants and the sound. So we're using a similar technique here, where sine tones, somewhat like the ones you heard in the jar piece, are coming up through the tube, going into the bodies of the singers. They're singing with those sine tones and causing acoustic beating and all of these disturbances and kind of wrestling with this energy that is getting fed into their bloodstream and into their bodyscape. And I'll, again, just play a little bit of us working with these mouth tubes. Apologies again for the harsh endings. Last, I want to just show the tripwires, which culminate the piece. For the vast majority of the hour-long experience, those subwoofers, as I mentioned, are vibrating too low for humans to hear, but towards the end, they ramp up to 30 hertz, so just sort of at our low end, like kind of club bass level sub. And when they do that, there's some taut lines that are connected to cones in the center, the audience space, that had been still, and they're attached to the grid above them. They had been still the entire experience, looked infrastructural, looked rigid. And at the moment, this moment in the piece, when we cross into that realm of audibility, they actually activate in these really complex and chaotic waveforms that are hearable and visible at this point. Thank you all for watching. I think that's, just a bit about how some of this aggregates into larger forms and how I'm interested in these kind of cathartic, somatic spaces where we can slow down into these intensities and scales of emotion and feeling and processing that I think are really absent from other areas of culture and really other spaces of art intaking. Exhibition spaces and openings don't have that same collective focus, that same turning off of the phones that concerts still somehow call forth in us. So it's sort of my extra linguistic offering to the dialogue.
I really love that idea of refusing readily available language and looking for these other musical grammars through which to express what no doubt creates a kind of shared feeling in the space, even if it's just the physical feeling of vibration, or whether it's the feeling of intensity that comes from the extreme loudness. It's a reminder that language actually limits what it is that we want to say to each other sometimes, and there can be an opening up to other forms of signification. I guess I'll ask one question and then we'll open it up and see where we are time-wise. But there must be a big difference between staging something like The Force of Things, which of course is operatic and has a kind of a sense of a set to it, with people with scripts that they're following, even if it's not according to a usual score, and then a club space where there's a level of the random and the entropic and people moving in ways that you may or may not expect. And how do you score for such different spaces as part of the same practice?
I think the kind of crowd experiment, the experiments of togetherness is really an ongoing one in my practice. And tonight we really activated a brand new experiment. I've never done that with this many people. So I'd say it's an ever evolving inquiry. I think I'm looking for both a kind of, and in the staging of Hive Rise, actually both. So at Bergheim, there's sort of like a pre-show where I perform and also 15 kind of mover vocalists who are projecting their voices through these 3D printed megaphones that are incredibly directional, so you can just like whisper through them from 20 feet or meters, whatever y'all are thinking in, away, and like feel like the whispers like hitting you right behind the neck. So it really collapses intimacy. So those folks are moving through the space, and there's this kind of labyrinthian opening where they're wandering, and the audience is finding their way through in Berghain, the kind of literal labyrinth of that space. And at the MoCA Geffen, we were inside of this open 14,000 square foot warehouse that Xavi's sort of panels and lighting, and we hung these plastic meat curtains that people moved through to try to recreate this sense of discovery and mystery and kind of the unscripted encounter that happens in club spaces and not so often, in my experience, in gallery or museum spaces. But then I come in the sort of second, it's a seamless transition. I come in though in the sort of second act and deeper into the space and kind of lure everybody back there. And then the megaphonist joined me on stage for a while and then reemerged back into the crowd. And so there's this sort of motion from a state of this disparate attention into this really focal, embodied listening that happens throughout that piece.
I know we all wish we could be there.
Yeah.
I do. Does anyone like to ask a question? Maybe we have time for one or two. Kostas, I think. Yeah, the back there.
I was really intrigued before we did the interior listening protocol. I was really intrigued by the fragility. You talked about doing that in this space with all these people and all these pint glasses that could shatter and smash, and that piece was not created with that kind of fragility. So I was just curious how that felt for you to experience that piece with that new dimension.
I kind of loved it. I mean, again, just the sort of the quotidian aspect of the jars making this very heavy metaphor of the shared violence we're all holding in our hands, making that really literal, and like they could smash. And again, thank you, Kostas, and the entire production team for figuring out how the hell to do that and whether it passes fire code, all the other things that kind of come up with that more literal risk. I think was a really interesting thing to feel as a collective. And again, I'm really curious how it felt for everybody in the audience. I was in the front row, but yeah, it feels really like a doorway and something I'm interested in. Thanks.
Sorry, I've got the back here. I don't have a question. I just have some observations which are kind of under the umbrella of context. The conversation started with Jack asking a question about the transition from storage jars to pint glasses, which kind of implied a loss of the connotations of storage jars. But my observation is that you brought it to the UK, which has a heavy drinking culture based around pints, and in fact, one of the meanings of to glass someone, glassing, is to jab a broken pint pot into somebody's body as a weapon. Wow. So that was one context which has arrived. I bring it here. Another thing was I was aware that I and people like me were having a different experience to others in the audience, in that those of us wearing glasses would have the tap, particularly when we were moving our heads side to side, the tap of the rim on the glass, whereas people not wearing glasses would not have that. And from that I led on to the thinking about, in this extended heat wave, we will all be producing more sweat and more earwax in our ear canals, and that will also be affecting the experience of your experiment.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a lot about, I mean, maybe in a similar spirit to the anti-monumentality that Xavi and P-Staff both bring up, and the ever-permutating experience of their temporary architectures. Again, which glass you have, whether you're wearing glasses, what those laptop speakers are doing, they're all going to change the experience, but I have yet to encounter a set of constraints that doesn't experience some kind of wonder at that intersecting apparatus of, again, kind of energetic field amplification and filter, the filter of the body, the filter of the object. So the score is not meant to be a score of mastery that, again, sort of with a specificity dictates what you do or presumes what you will experience. It's an invitation to exploration of a phenomena that I hope everybody learns and starts to gain confidence that they can play and experiment with themselves. And so they're all really conducting and choreographing their own way through.
Yeah, unless somebody already has a mic.
Oh, thanks so much, Asha. I loved that.
Oh, thanks.
I loved it. At first, it made me think of saxophonists like John Coltrane and Kenny Garrett and sort of bend. And the jazz scene in London at the moment is top of the game.
Amazing.
But I also wondered about things like neurofeedback and how it affects the brain and reprograms the waves and sort of trauma-informed approaches and healing qualities in that exercise and the sort of meditative, communal, contemplative experience that I had. So I wondered about healing the body and what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sam. And I hope I get to experience some of that top jazz culture before we head out on Monday. I am clearly very, very interested and drawn to and kind of navigate by the way sound hits the body and feels in my body and feels in the bodies that are kind of generous enough to share their impressions with me about the sonic experiences I create and how it affects them. There is a certain wellness industry in the US in particular, kind of around sound baths and the kind of ritualization of sound that I find has been quite commodified. And I also, maybe this is the same older brother's anti-participator in me, but I don't really like to be told that I'm gonna have a healing experience or that I'm gonna have a kink experience, or, there's something I'm trying to do, which is like lure people into a kind of body awakeness a little bit without them knowing, maybe. And again, I think maybe consent gets a little weird there, but nothing about this is actually pornographic, is actually, I guess the glasses are a kind of risk. And yet, there is a sense of like, people might not necessarily, some people would walk themselves to a sound bath and say, heal me with the, binaural beats of this. Many people would not and sort of shut off, I think, to that boundary. So there's something in the naming that scares me, or that I honor those and learn from those traditions, but I think also try to find a way in and through these somatic experiences that aren't just about healing and aren't just kind of leaning on lineages that have perfected that for millennia, really.
One more there.
Sure.
Hi.
Yeah.
I sort of have a couple of questions, and then I'll throw it out there, and then you can sort of leave it up to you, whichever one you feel like is the interesting to comment on. So I'm wondering about, you mentioned there's sounds which are like too low frequency for humans to like register and hear it. So maybe if you want to like talk more about that. And then the other thing is about noise sensitivity and specifically how neurotypical response versus neurodivergent response to the same sounds depending on the levels of sensitivity, and like if you came across that, if you work, if you explore that in some way. And then the last thing, I guess, was more like the tech side of it, because when you're kind of recording and processing sound and then you're using the speakers again to project it, it's all, as the sound gets processed, it all kind of affects it and changes that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sorry if that's like
Let me try to jump into the middle and we'll see if we have time to get to the others. One of the reasons I'm really interested in unfixed audience setups that I really don't work in a proscenium way, again, like imagine you're on a laptop, that's why we're all looking at a flat screen right now, has a bit to do with this being able to tune your intensity level with proximity, so you can move closer to a phenomenon or farther away, kind of depending on your hunger for that kind of extreme sensory provocation. I think there's a real violence actually in static listening situations where we feel, of course you could get up and leave, but there's a lot of social pressure keeping us there. And the world I was sort of raised in is not just the risk of loudness, and but also there's just worldviews written into these arrangements, right? So if you're thinking about an orchestra, you have an audience which is just in polite parallel oblivion, not acknowledging one another, not looking at one another, staring at a dude swinging around his stick and like controlling hundreds of performers if you're, again, in an orchestra context, with the sort of flick of his wrist. I mean, all of that, the kind of politics of that, the power structures of that, the fixity of that, the rigidity of that, is something I have really sought to dissolve in my work. And so I think that flexibility, I'm interested in the edge, but I can't assume everyone's edge is the same. So in this, again, the experience of the jars, for me, it gets intense when those sine tones are really bouncing. If you don't want to feel them, you just take your jars off. Like, it's not like I'm holding them there and sort of forcing them on each body in the same way. And just to the sort of bouncing of waveforms in the space and the processing of, or the filtration of speaker, yes. And I think that gets to, I'm really interested in space, actually, in the way waveforms move and how it changes. And again, this kind of liquid phenomenon of vibration that's been running through the last 2 days, speaks to the interest in the disinterest in fixity, the disinterest in universality of experience, and the active interest in kind of unsettling those notions of the art form and the artwork as a kind of bounded, uniform offering.
All right, this has been an incredible hour of transforming us into membranes where sound is bouncing off of us, between us, through us, and turning us into willing or unwilling assemblies. So I feel changed in some way. I hope you do too. And I really, really thank you, Ash, for your virtuosity, even if we don't want that word. It feels like the most appropriate, and for sharing this incredible work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.